So welcome everyone to the online book launch of our book, which has been recently published with Springer, The Role of Social Inequality in Parent Engagement, with the subtitle From Inequality to Social Justice in Education. So first of all, I have to express gratitude to all the authors who worked really hard on all the chapters, because otherwise this book wouldn't have been possible, and also to the editors and Springer, who were quite supportive, collaborative, and really very efficient as well. Short agenda for our today's meeting. First, there'll be an introduction, so I'll speak briefly about the book, and then we'll have short presentations by chapter authors, and these are the chapters 2, 9, 4, 7, 13, and 16. We changed the order for feasibility purposes. And then we'll have remarks from Dr. Debbie Pusher, who is our discussant, and we'll have a Q&A period for people to be able to ask questions and for us to have a short discussion. So obviously, I'm not going to surprise anybody to mention that parent engagement matters, right? It is very important for academic achievement, well-being, and sense of belonging, and there is vast literature. And also we know that over the last 40 years, maybe more than 40 years, there's been a rise of intensive parenting, where there is sort of cultural expectation in most Western contexts, and I think in other parts of the world as well, that there are increased expectations for parents to be engaged in their kids' education, schooling and learning, spending time and money, and advocating on their children's behalf to make sure that they succeed academically. At the same time, policymakers discovered parent engagement as a useful tool, or what they see as a useful tool. Parents can be more responsible for education compared to the government. So there's been some kind of shift in, this neoliberal government mentality going on once again from like late 1970s. So we know that parent engagement is not just about schools, and it's not just about parents. It's about both sides, right? So this is what parents are doing at home, in the community, in schools, but also what teachers do in schools that is related to parents, but also not just in schools, but often this work goes also into the community and sometimes into the family domain in case of family, when teachers go and visit families. Those two things are happening at the same time. Once again, there is a vast literature going back to Pierre Bourdieu, even not to 1986, but to like late 60s, early 70s, when it was published in French, showing that parents and families often have different levels of economic, social, cultural capital, and they unfortunately receive different returns on their investment in the school system. So all parents want the best education for their children, but often the outcomes are kind of complicated because of its entrenched inequality, and especially if educators privilege, often inadvertently, of course, the engagement of some families at the expense of others. And we know that there are prominent inequities that are based on social class, race, gender, immigration status, and disability status. And I have to mention that our book talks about class, race, gender, immigration, but we have this kind of missing part, unfortunately. So we're not talking about much about families of children with additional support needs. So I think that's, it's important to acknowledge that kind of missing piece, and that's something that needs to be done, obviously, more. Here comes sort of the idea of our book, right? The book has two sections with a number of chapters more or less equally split. So the first one is called Highlighting Inequality, and here authors mention, how engagement is unequal, right? Based on race, social class, immigration status, gendered nature of parent engagement, of course, institutional barriers and, cultural barriers and all sorts of constraints. Authors of chapters in this section, they are also mentioning, the possible, recommendations how to improve the situation, but they are kind of highlighting inequality kind of most of all. And in the second part, opportunities for social justice, the focus is a little bit different. So once again, acknowledging inequalities, because, that's essential But thinking about new ways of working or thinking about parent and family engagement, and we use frameworks. Some of them are well known, others are more recent. For example, funds of knowledge, parent knowledge, black placemaking, and land-based pedagogies, to think about what can be done in order to improve the situation, in order to make sure that families and parents can participate more or less equally, and to achieve social justice through parent engagement, essentially. Um, so today, we have a privilege to listen to authors of several chapters. First, we'll have Janet Goodall, who is going to talk about teacher beliefs about parents, deficits, disregard, and denial. So I think it's going to be a very powerful conceptual chapter to start us on. And then we'll move actually to chapter 9, and we'll have Yvette Leong and Nutsa Kovahidze talking about parentocracy in the spotlight. So that would be a quantitative study from Hong Kong, focusing on tutoring and how parents and students work together in that domain. Then we'll hear from Suma Dean talking about Muslim mothers and the invisible labor in parent engagement in England, followed by Rachel Helena Meir, also talking about reframing gendered parent engagement. How do we promote social justice within a discourse which overburdens mothers? Then we will watch a video pre-recorded by Nana Adupoku, Raquel Brown, Nanette Broadbelt, and Vidya Shah from Canada. They couldn't make it live, but they sent a video recording. And finally, we'll have Rohad Zaidi, Patid Trusla, and Anusha Kasan talking about resilience in education, newcomer families, and the power of parent engagement. And the task, so to say, for our presenters was in 7 or 8 minutes to talk about the chapter and try to answer these two questions. So how does your chapter highlight inequality in parent engagement, and what possibilities for social justice do you see in family-centric, equitable, and democratic parent engagement? So yeah, I'll stop here. Okay, and yeah, so we'll proceed. So Janet, the floor is yours.
Power. Excellent. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk through some of the ideas in my chapter. And beginning with a bit of a caveat, I call myself a reluctant theorist. I never set out to be a theorist. I set out to be a qualitative researcher who got very annoyed at the lack of theory that I was finding around some of the issues that we're still talking about. So my chapter highlights inequality, looking at a specific idea around it. Schools as sites of social reproduction, which Max has already mentioned. We all know about it, but we rarely think about it, I think. And one of the interesting things to me is that I don't think you can train to be a teacher in many places without thinking about Bronfenbrenners and all those circles around the child. But we often don't realize that those circles apply to us as well. And they apply to the teachers in our schools. So we're as influenced by our society as everyone else is, but we often don't think about it that way. And teachers work within their societies. Middle class norms apply in schools, and Max mentioned social capital, social and cultural capital. And often in the literature, we hear about families lacking social and cultural capital. They don't lack social and cultural capital at all. They merely lack the social and cultural capital that's being valued at a particular time. They have the social and cultural capital they need to survive in the areas and milieu in which they're surviving. And that's just a way of getting into the fact that we often don't see exactly what's in front of us, and we don't see some of the inequalities around us. And that's why I was interested in the concept of critical race theory. And just to give a couple more examples of that, and I highlight Gloria Ladstone's Billings' really good paper, It's Not a Culture of Poverty, It's a Poverty of Culture. She asked her white middle-class students about culture, and they were convinced they didn't have a culture. Culture is something that happens to someone else. And if you search on Google Images for culture, you get lots of pictures of scarab beetles and pyramids or whatever. What you don't get is a picture of a mobile phone. my mobile phone is very much a part of a cultural artifact for me. And another way of looking at it is we constantly hear in the UK, I should say, by the way, that education has devolved in the UK. So I'm working in a very different educational system in Wales than my colleagues in England are. But we still hear about children with English as a second language rather than saying, wow, that child is multilingual. We're saying the same thing, but in saying a child is multilingual, we're looking at the asset rather than at the strength, rather than the issue. And what this means is not that teachers don't mean well. Teachers do mean well. School staff mean well. You don't stay in education in the current, in the current situation for the glory or the money or, the hours or whatever. You stay in it because you're a dedicated professional. However, we are all dedicated professionals who are influenced by the society around us. And we live in an inequitous society, we live in a racist society, we live in a gendered society, and we live in an ageist society, says the oldest person in her entire faculty. But we're often not aware of the fact that we actually are influenced by this. And as I say in the book, teachers are really good people, but they're caught up in an inequitous society and often reproduce that inequitous society because they haven't had the chance, the space, the reflexivity to actually question it. And if you're working a 60-hour week, as many of our teachers are in the UK, where are you going to find that time? And often, in a lot of the projects that I've seen around parental engagement, we're trying to fix the wrong problem. We're trying to fix parents. We're trying to make sure that all of our parents, no matter where they come from, act like middle-class white parents, because that's what we think is a good idea. And that's what we've been told about parenting styles and all the rest of it. But if you look at the literature on parenting styles, for example, those work really well in weird societies, white, industrialized, educational, I've forgotten what the R stands for, and democratic, and I can't spell weird on a Friday afternoon. And the parental engagement literature, interestingly, often ignores issues of race. We treat teachers and parents as though they were these homogenous blobs of groups of people. And that's why I wanted to really begin thinking about how we could apply critical race theory. And I will hold my hand up and say I'm at the very beginning of this, but if we don't start at the beginning, we're not going to get anywhere. But the tenets of critical race theory, as put forward by the people that really study this day in and day out, one of them is that society sees racism as normal. It's just the way things are. But that's how things are. And as anybody who knows me would expect me to, I am now going to say, go away and read Gramsci, and you will understand that a bit better. There's also a denial of the impact of the systematic oppression that people face. And we are very, very good in the UK and in other areas in any neoliberal society for blaming people for their own poverty. People are in poverty because, well, I see them, they've all got mobile phones. Well, yes, how are you going to get a doctor's appointment if you don't have a mobile phone? The third element of it is a dedication to social justice. And for the last 25 years, I've been asking teachers why they went into education. And it almost always comes down to something that has to do with a dedication to social justice. It's about making things better for people as we go on. But we need to do that in a way that will actually disrupt the system. And I'll come to that in a minute. Critical race theory privileges the lived experiences of people of color, which clearly I cannot do from my own background, but I can do in my research. I can listen to people. I can reproduce exactly what people say rather than what I think they meant. I can read my students writing in English as they speak English rather than as I think they ought to speak English. And that's a very important point for those of us in universities, I think. And also it's interdisciplinary. So we need to be learning from each other. We need to be learning from the psychologists and the sociologists, even the physicists. I'm not sure exactly what we need to learn from the physicists, but we do need something. It runs counter, critical race theory runs counter to the idea of meritocracy. And the problem with meritocracy is that it's really comfortable. because it tells those of us who have done well, those of us who have done well in the system, those of us who've got good jobs, those of us who've got chairs, professors, whatever, that's because we're good people and because we've worked hard. And I'm not saying we aren't good people, and I'm not saying we haven't worked hard, but I'm also saying that we were privileged to be able to do the things that we were doing. We are not going to fix anything if we keep doing what we've always done. And I'd like you to think about that drawer in your kitchen at the moment that you can't open. We've all got a drawer somewhere that you can't open. The fish slice is stuck. The fish slice has been stuck in it for the last 10 years. And every day you go and you kind of wiggle it, hoping that the fish slice will move and you can open that drawer. We can't open the drawer, and we can't fix the system if we continue to do what we've always done. We need to problematize, we need to question what we do, and we need to be disruptive. I tell all of my students that I want them to become the person that other people think, oh, wow, I can't tell that joke when she's in the room. No, you can't. You can't make that comment when I'm in the room either, not without me pressing back. And that's what we all need to be doing. We need to change society, and we need to change schools. And that may sound like it's a circular argument, and it is a circular argument because schools are sites of social reproduction. If we change what happens in schools, we will change what happens in society. And that's, if you read what we want from schools. And we are parts of the system, but we can be cogs that grate on the system. And I would suggest that all of you continue to be cogs that grate in the system. Teachers go into education because they want to be change agents. You want things to be different. Every time you plan a lesson, you're thinking how you want your students to be different when they walk out of the classroom. You want to think about how they want to be different when they walk out of the school as well, or the system. And there are signs of hope. And the final bit of my chapter is about hopeful discourse. And I feel extremely privileged to work in Wales because, as I say, education has devolved. And we have a system of family engagement officers in Wales. And there's increasing research about them, but they are generally people from the community, and they work to be a liaison between the community and the school. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read you the Welsh Government ideas, the 4 ideas about what education should be, what it should lead to. And we want to have ambitious, capable learners ready to learn. There'll be enterprising, creative contributors. There'll be ethical, informed citizens, and there'll be healthy and confident individuals. What's missing from that is the workplace. We are not necessarily training people just for the workplace. We're training people for good lives. And it's lovely to see Welsh Government actually being really up to date and going straight back to John Dewey and talking about what education actually should be about. And that's what most of us went into education thinking about, and it gets ground out of us. And I would like us all to have the time to think about it. And that's a very different view of schooling. Change is possible. If we're willing to be uncomfortable enough, if we're willing to question enough, and it isn't a comfortable journey. I'm fortunate to have a family member who is constantly calling me up and telling me, Mum, that's an ageist term, that's an ableist term, or whatever. That's great. We all need that. We need to be disruptive, but we need to be hopeful, because I think we owe it to all of our young people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Janet, very much for your powerful words and, important theoretical, conceptual, philosophical contribution to our discussion here in the book and outside of this space. Yeah, just in the global space of discussions around education. Wonderful. So I think now we have Yvette, right?
Yes. Let me share my screen. So, okay. I think all of you should be able to see the screen, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. So thank you so much, Janet. I love your presentation. I've been taking lots of notes, and I thought, this is a really good opening to start our presentation. So thank you, Max, again for offering the opportunity for us to co-author in this chapter. In this chapter, we focus on parent selection of tutors, essentially their choice. What are some of the factors of consideration that they have in mind when they are choosing the type of tutoring or tutors for their children? So we're in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has always been known for the very high popularity of students going for after-class tutorial classes. So we thought, because in this book, we're also talking about parental engagement, private tutoring is one of the most overt settings where parents can actually exercise their financial power, resources to decide or to choose something that they think is most, beneficial to their children. So that's why we've been exploring that in this chapter. And for our chapter, we also employ parentocracy as a conceptual lens. And parentocracy essentially is an education ideology or transformation where basically it means that parents can now use their aspiration and wealth or resources to shape students' learning outcome and trajectories. So this is essentially what we want to explore. So allow me to present a little bit more about the participants. So this is a qualitative study. So we've been having semi-structured interviews with 41 parents. These parents, they have their daughters studying in the same local government-aided girls' secondary school in Hong Kong. And actually, this school is one of the higher banding schools in Hong Kong with a very much a competitive admission process. So we've been speaking to these parents to understand, how they actually choose the tutors that they are employing and what are some of the, consideration that they have at that time. And this comes to our key findings for this qualitative study. When we talk about private tutoring, especially in Hong Kong, almost like a cradle for private tutoring, and we tend to think that for parents to choose private tutoring or tutors, they must be stressing a lot on grade improvement, the scores. But actually, in our study, what we found is that grade improvement is one of the factors, but it's not the only one, and it's also not the most important factor in their whole consideration. And in the selection process, all these are actually what we have now as the different categories, which they also prioritize when they are in the process of selection. Rapport, relationship, compatibility, which I'll explain a little bit more later on. Tutors' teaching methods and styles are also what they concern most. Type, sites, and even modes of tutoring, whether it's large group size, whether it's small, face-to-face, online tutoring. Effectiveness and outcomes, of course, it's improved. But at the same time, the cost, convenience, and commute far for that particular tutorial classes, it's also what they have been, thinking a lot when they do the selection. And at the end, learning ethos and peer influence at the tutoring center. So allow me to explain a little bit more about rapport and relationship, because when I was speaking to the parents, actually a lot of them, when I asked them, what do you consider most important when you think of hiring this tutor or not? And then they all said to me the same Chinese term, gap, which translates closely to compatibility. So basically what they mean by compatibility is how the tutor matches with their kid. And this match could be, it's the teaching style, whether they will be able to explain concepts in teens language, whether they will be able to use lots of ample examples to illustrate some concepts and theory. But at the same time, you think like being compatible, it's almost like, very much an inborn natural compatibility. There might be that chance, but it's more about how the tutor adapt their original teaching style and try to really, adapt to the way that this student would learn best. So there is this sense of adjustment that the tutor is willing to make in order to, cater for the needs of the students. And I always like to quote one of the direct quotes from one of the parent interviewees, and she was commenting basically compatibility is like seeing a doctor that every doctor can prescribe medicine, but the treatment might not suit every patient, and you have to change, switch in between several doctors to find and try different medicines to finally recover. And I thought this is exactly what they meant by compatibility, that these parents, they're willing to try to experiment with tutors and to finally land on, the right match for their student. So this is, almost the key findings. And it brings us to, I think, two very broader or important implications, which is that what I've been observing in the findings is that tutors now, instead of just, treated as a knowledge transmitter, almost like helping with the academic side only, there actually have been assumed by the parents to take up multiple roles. So some tutors will be, told by parents almost like a mediator, working between parents and students whenever they have conflicts, whenever conflicts arise. And some of them will be treated like a learning companion or even a counselor to answer a lot of, teens' questions. And I thought that point also explains why compatibility has been highly prioritized in parents' consideration instead of the mere, grade improvement as the whole, basket of consideration. And the other point I really want to draw into, it's also how students now have been in the center of the whole selection process. If you remember at the very beginning, I said we use parentocracy as a notion. And this parentocracy as a notion has always been assumed in the past literature to be very much parent-driven. But in all the findings, what we found out is that the final decision is basically dependent on students' preference and their choice. So parents are only using their resources to accommodate what they feel, who they feel most comfortable, in these tutorial classes. So this is like a key summary of the parents' criteria, some of the preferred characteristics among all the 6 criteria. So I'll also like to, keep on this page, but to answer Mike's question about, social inequalities, but at the same time, possibilities for social justice, for a more democratic parental engagement. I thought if you see it, the type and modes of tutoring, of course, a lot of parents said that they prefer smaller class size, and if best, it can be one-on-one in-person classes. So that actually gives privilege to middle-class families who can afford to pay for, these options that are obviously more expensive. But at the same time, when we think of compatibility, as I explained earlier, compatibility is not something which you can use money to buy. So you can, you can experiment, you can try a few tutors to finally find the one who actually works best with the kid. So that, to me, I think it offers some space for us to think of that this might be a new possibility to address the existing inequalities that is presented to some working class parents who thought that they can only afford, basic or below standard tutoring. What we've been finding is that parents have been shifting their consideration or their preferred preference for the tutors. So I'm just thinking that I do not have a very clear-cut answer to this question, but I thought, this study might open up the space for more discussion around whether this, new shifting or more student-driven discourse in parental engagement might actually offer us some solutions to address the current inequalities, which we see often hindering a lot of working class families. So this is just a very brief presentation for my chapter. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth, very
so
much.
much.
Yeah. Thank you, Beth. I think talking about the agency of students creates these spaces for, more kind of democratic discussions. So yeah, I think, and there is a stereotype about East Asian education systems with heavy tutoring, which I think is, I guess, partially true, but then you add to this story, right? Add in that, like, it's not just, tutoring, but what happens in those spaces and how different members of different social classes navigate this space, and the role of and the changing role of students and their agency. Yeah, thank you so much, Yvette. Yeah. So now we are moving from parents in Hong Kong to Muslim mothers in England. So Suma, go ahead. Sorry, you're muted. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, wherever you all are. And thank you to Max for the invitation to write, to contribute to this great book, and also to contribute today. So thank you to start with. Okay, so my chapter, which I'll be talking about, I don't have a presentation, is taking 3 samples from the 52 mothers that I interviewed a while back about their experience of navigating the UK state school system for their children. And they went into a lot of themes about their own education, their own identity, and so forth. So I took just 3 mothers' narratives, little parts, and this chapter is built around the emotional and the invisible labors that they do. And so in terms of answering Max's question about, what does my chapter highlight, I'll actually be talking about what's invisible, which is a bit more difficult than what's tangible. So the invisible labors that I'll be discussing are actually to do with 4 or 5 areas, and I'll just try to summarize those. The first is really the mental stress and the anxiety that a lot of Muslim mothers carry, and that came through the data from the mothers, which is revolves around their identity on a macro level. And by this I mean, so number 1, I mean that their institutional and the anti-Muslim sentiment that is often in structural places apart from schools. It's, it might be with health and work and other areas, but it all affects the way they know they are seen and the way they see themselves and the way their families are seen. And research on this has been forthcoming both in the US and in the UK. And from an interdisciplinary point of view, it's been really interesting to see how clinical psychologists are looking at how anti-Muslim hate crimes, from the smallest, it might be something verbal, to something on a bigger scale, how it actually affects people psychologically. And so there are clinical psychologist papers on how other policies, for example, the counter-terrorism prevent policy in the UK, how that's linked and inflated racism and anti-Muslim sentiments, leading to very noticeable emotional and mental impacts that are negative on both men and women. But as I focus on Muslim mothers, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about what exactly it is that they voiced in the 3 mothers whose narratives are in this chapter. So one of the other areas, the second area that brings about this sort of emotional, mental weight on them, that is not vocalized at school or in staff meetings. It's just something that they're carrying, which is the weight of representation. And this happens because of 2 things. One, it's the sort of political structures that are very good at othering Muslim communities, again, because of global events, local events. There's that whole area. And the second is challenging misinformation in the media. So both of those areas require Muslim mothers in all different interactions with school, whether it's a playground, whether it's a staff meeting, whether it's something that's meant to be very enjoyable, like, extracurricular things happening in schools, where they're often questioned immediately and meant to be able to explain, geopolitics and a whole range of media sensationalized headlines. Often that in itself is a big study on what are true, genuine headlines and what's fictional. That's another whole subject. But that weight of representation is something that's often not understood. And all these things together bring about a type of stress and anxiety that can become a barrier to parent engagement. And it's not obvious, okay, unless somebody talks about it, or we do more research into this. So that was the second area. It's like the weight of representation. And one of the mothers in that chapter actually at the time talked about the Charlie Hebdo atrocity that happened, and that was 2015, and then all the discourse around freedom of speech, and where they have to explain away or disassociate publicly to show that they're not part of that whole discourse of what happened, right up to 2024, when we see the Maria Hussein case in the UK. This was a mother who was pregnant, Muslim mother, who was carrying the placard, some of you might remember, with the coconut on it, and that became very controversial. And she was went through a whole court case, of which she came out completely, she was exonerated from that. But the point there is that it was again a case of looking at how identity, free speech, representation, all of these things are a daily constant stress on mothers who are at the forefront of interacting for their children's education. The third area that comes up in the data from these mothers is like the work of conviviality, and that's really like the area of how multicultural communities interact with one another in a way where they have to work incredibly hard to kind of put people at ease when they shouldn't need to do that, because and this, the theory around this is that basically any minoritized communities who don't fit the sort of white European normativity have to make a lot of extra work, emotional, mental labor, basically, to put people at ease. And so that's another area of effort and work that goes in that's unseen. The fourth area is dealing with, from a policy perspective, dealing with the prevent discourse and the radicalization. Now, the mother who brought this up, this actually highlighted the messages of senior leadership in the school she was working in, where the identities of the Muslim children and families were completely skewed because of the prevent discourse and radicalization discourse. So these were the stresses that come with managing a securitized identity. And she discussed what that actually means, in real terms, when the places that your family and your children are used to going to, at mosque, for example, are really put in school in a very negative light, and completely there's no accountability about that. So the school may well have a very, a good Ofsted, for example, but leadership can say things which are really unprofessional and actually untrue. And what's the impact then on Muslim mothers who are actually staff in that school? So her narrative pointed out that whole theme of what do you do as a mother when you're dealing with a securitized identity. And the final point that, sort of a major point that came up was the point of the third mother, which was about realizing that being ordinary is just not good enough with all the identity that your child carries, and that gives rise to intensive parenting methods. And that strain, that feeling that being average or just being good at one thing is just not going to get you anywhere in the structural inequalities that exist in school and beyond, and having to push your children a lot harder, and sometimes to their detriment, because you feel that you've got to sort of compensate for all the things I've just mentioned before. Now, to just try and go a little bit, just a minute or two into the area of what possibilities do you see in the family-centric, equitable and democratic parent engagement to sort of move forward, like what are the solutions? At the school level, it is very much about restructuring the relationship between the school and families, so that things that are already out there about co-construction of school priorities. So they are actually not just talking to parents as people to keep distant and just like clients, but actually as partners. Things like valuing family knowledge and heritage, and valuing that these parents have authority in their culture, in their heritage, which can overcome some of the stresses that I've just discussed. And they can inform staff, inform the school community in a way that enriches all children's experiences. Some other ways that this could be, I suppose, alleviated is to have more dialogue, like genuine dialogue that's two-way and listening, asking and not assuming. So that alone would actually relieve a lot of parents who are going through these kind of carrying very heavy emotional and mental strains, if they were just asked sometimes, not to explain geopolitics, but just asked about culture and heritage and backgrounds, and valuing those things genuinely rather than sort of as a tick box exercise. But I will end my last point on, while these structures and these projects that work very well in a lot of schools that I have seen, where they genuinely are partnering with the parents, I would still say the solution is a lot more to do with the individual and the training, right back to training teachers. And as Janet said, they are good people who want to have, who want to see social justice. And I think at that point of training and really discussing parent engagement, it's a time where there should be more reflective thinking and opportunity to genuinely look at what biases they carry, what version of history they understand, and where they are on the sort of spectrum of understanding decolonization and colonization and all of that. So I would, sort of go back on a personal note and say that the way forward is really about introspection, which, it hopefully will help to improve the lack of equality in certain structural spaces. Thank you very much for the time, Max.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much very much. Yeah, for very sort of actionable. I mean, not necessarily easy to achieve some of this, like changing the mindset, of course, but specific suggestions in terms of what needs to be done, what can be done to alleviate the existing inequities. In this case, focusing on Muslim mothers in England, right? So now we have Rachel, who's going to talk about overburdened mothers, right? So there is this connection in terms of burden on mothers. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just try and share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, I think yes, we can. Yeah,
you got it. Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, thank you, Max, for including me both in the book and talking here this afternoon. So my chapter does focus on the gendered inequalities of parent engagement. In particular, it aims to show that. Oh, sorry. Move my slide on. I don't know my slide moved on for you.
No. Okay, now it is.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so it's aiming to show that this gendered inequality is persistent, significant, and in need of transformation. And in the chapter, I identify 3 different burdens that mothers experience. which are temporal, pedagogic, and emotional. So the basis of the argument in this chapter is that although we can argue that parent engagement is a social justice tool for children, what we need to guard against is not making it a social injustice tool for their mothers. And I do that by firstly challenging that parent engagement is in any way gender neutral. It's not, it's highly gendered. Mother's educational labour is long established by writers like Diane Ray and Miriam David and many others. And in the chapter, I use the concept of the good schooling mother. That concept is highly moralised. So the good schooling mother is both judged externally by society and judges herself if she does not meet the social expectations of her to be engaged in her child's schooling. And I ask, what do mothers risk, therefore, by complying in this way? In the chapter, I use primary homework as the context for looking at how parents, in this case mothers, are engaged with their children's learning. And the data from the chapter is taken from data gathered in 2018-19 and then again in 2024. And that's useful because it enables me to challenge the idea that mothers' burdening was somehow short-term during that homeschooling period of the pandemic as a kind of crisis within a crisis. My data kind of bookends that and shows that no, it's kind of an ongoing burden. So I've just taken one of those three burdens to talk about this afternoon. I'm going to home in on pedagogic burdens. So homework is generally framed as this kind of simple, universal task, and therefore parents' engagement with it is assumed to be basic and straightforward. However, teachers make a lot of assumptions about mothers' pedagogic knowledge when they set homework tasks, and this creates challenges in the work to meet the educational specifications. So teachers themselves have these understandings, conceptions, and orientations. In other words, the pedagogic and content knowledge that enables them to help children's learning progress. In contrast, many non-specialist mothers don't have these kind of pedagogic tools. And so following expectations of engagement in homework is difficult because they need to acquire somehow these tools and knowledges and these unfamiliar pedagogies before they can fully engage in the set assignment. If we look at one of the mothers that I feature in the chapter then, Fiona, she describes how for her and her child, homework tasks are often inappropriate. They're just frankly way too hard for him. And this necessitates additional labour for her, which is highly pedagogic in nature. And so she talks about having to think ahead. And that thinking ahead means making decisions about what her child can or cannot access from the homework task, how he might access that task, and whether or not she's actually going to have to modify or adapt the task in some way to allow him to access it. And this is all pedagogic skill. It's a significant engagement for her as well, but it's entirely unacknowledged by a system which constructs a parent's engagement in homework as either simple or universal. And for Fiona, it was made worse by the fact that there was pressure on her to close an academic gap for her son, so he was seen to be falling behind. And the teachers made it clear that what she did at home, in their words, made a difference. And that was without understanding that in saying that overloaded her with and made it even more overwhelming for her. So her pedagogic work was made central to her child's development, and it was no longer viewed as a kind of optional extra or preferred. It became central. And this is going beyond the scholarly framing of the engaged parent, in which we would see the engaged parent as demonstrating an interest in their child's development, and it's absolutely foisting upon them this very pedagogic involvement, which requires school knowledges, school methods, and even sometimes school resources. So Fiona talks about the fact that she has to purchase special tools in order to help her child to access the tasks that the school set. So this deep commitment to curriculum specifics leads Fiona to reflect that actually she's like a part-time teaching assistant. And she said that to me in quite a jokey way, but it's laden with the truth of her experience, which is highly pedagogized and very overwhelming. So universal expectations result in these complicated acts of pedagogic and epistemological labour as mothers anticipate, respond to, prepare for, and then provide for their child's academic needs. And obviously I talk more about pedagogic burden in the chapter, but I also give examples of emotional burdens and temporal burdens as well. So turning to the second question that Max posed for us, what can we do about this, essentially? What's the hope for moving forward? Well, the obvious response to that, when you read my chapter, is, well, we need to rebalance parent engagement and involve fathers more. And we probably do, but it sounds too simple because that sort of overlooks these very powerful moralized scripts of good mothering, in which forms of burden become deeply integrated into the gendered ways that parent engagement plays out. Mothers conform to these social expectations despite temporal stressors, pedagogic commitments, and negative emotions, because to defy the norms has social impacts. They know that they're likely to be judged. So we need to do other things too. So one of the things we probably should try and do is to develop better teacher conceptualizations of parent engagement, which might involve recognizing that there are many alternate ways to be engaged with your child's learning, and also for teachers to have a greater awareness of the practical burdens on mothers when these kinds of tasks are expected or set. And we also need to move away from these deficit framings. So when we talk about the hard to reach parent who doesn't appear to engage, or we talk about the entitled mother who kind of over engages, what we're doing is creating tensions in that partnership, and that's problematic. We probably, in the case of homework, need to move away from these conceptualizations, which are very highly pedagogic, or which frame it as universal and simple, because we need to start from the parent perspective. So on a practical basis, that means things like clearer instructions, simpler tasks, an awareness of pacing of things like this and how that impacts on families, and a consideration of whether there's specialised knowledge or educational capital required for things that you might ask a family to engage in. This probably means more tailored homework tasks to individuals, but certainly to communities, and making those activities much more culturally responsive and appropriate. One of the key things that the mothers in my chapter, though, demonstrate is the importance of flexibility in parent engagement and in tasks like homework, because one of the main ways the mothers navigated the difficulties and burdens that they had was through individualised decision making. So we mustn't try and fix the system and take away the flexibility. You know, it was the flexibility that enabled these mothers essentially to navigate and survive. We definitely need to revisibilise mothers' educational labour, because that momentary recognition during COVID and when we were all homeschooling and mothers and fathers saw what was going on, did not actually rebalance the mother-father educational labour in the way that it might have done. And so that probably means action at government and school level to tackle these gender discourses and recognise mothers' lived realities. And that would probably have the advantageous flip side that it would also tackle the injustice of fathers' absence from these kinds of engagement practices and discourses. But what I want to guard against is, in my chapter, de-skilling these mothers in any way. I don't want people to read this as oh, mothers are so terribly burdened, they can't manage it, they can't do it. Because in actual fact, all the mothers in the study were highly skilled and developed some quite sophisticated techniques for managing and navigating their burden. So the chapter is really about recognising both the burdens that mothers experience, but also the skills that they develop as well. So I don't think there's going to be an immediate rebalancing, given the powerful and moralised good mothering discourses. But what we probably need is a combination of broader and small-scale shifts, so that in the future children can flourish alongside mothers who are not being excessively burdened. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, very much. I think COVID offered an opportunity for people to rethink parent engagement, but I'm not sure it happened. So probably, those opportunities were wasted, really. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So the next group of authors couldn't make it in person, but they sent a short video, and I'm going to play this for you. So these are the authors of chapter, which is called Dear Black Parents. So, okay. So just a second, I need to reshare. Okay. Okay, and you should be able to hear it as well.
Hi, my name is Raquel, and I'm here with Vidya, Nana, and Nanette, and we are the writers that came together to write chapter 13 for this book. We apologize that we weren't able to be live on the Zoom, but we all had commitments that we couldn't break, but we decided to make this video instead of being there live. So I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about the title of the book, Dear Black Parents, Critical Counter Stories and Messy Conversations about the relationships between Black parents and schooling. And I just want to draw our attention to the word messy. As we were engaging in conversations from which the themes and the questions arose for this chapter, it was very messy work. And I think it's important to name that because in doing work that addresses anti-Black racism, we have to be willing to engage in work that is messy. And Nana and Nanette and I, as Black educators, also had to lean into that messiness. There were times when we were discussing and working together to write where a lot of the ideas that we were experiencing, we had to actually be a support system for each other because that messiness was coming through, but we decided to lean into it and see what it could become. And it turned out to be a beautiful conversation between 4 educators that turned into this beautiful chapter. So before I pass it over to Nana, I just wanted to read our introduction because I think it's a great segue into the rest of this conversation about the chapter. And it was actually written by Nanette as part of the introduction for her major research project. And it reads like this. Let us start by saying, sorry, not sorry. This paper is not for everyone. We are Black educators writing for Black families and as part of Black families, and we will not apologize for it. We will not water down our stories or change the language or perspective to make our paper more accessible to non-Black readers. Toni Morrison once said, what I'm interested in is writing about the gays without the white gaze. And that is the messiness that we engaged in as we wrote this paper. Go ahead, Nana.
Yeah, so these conversations were messy, but at the same time, they're also therapeutic because we created a space for each other to look forward to and engage in like open, transparent dialogue that we didn't really have many spaces to engage in on a day-to-day, especially given our work. So the 3 types of relationships we focused on in regards to schools and Black families were reciprocal relationships, authentic relationships, and justice-oriented relationships. And some of the topics and conversations we we had were about the concept of like neediness when it comes to Black families and how that is kind of a skewed perception because in reality there's a debt owed, and we went into a bit more detail about what this debt is and what it means. We talked about the experiences of Black educators and how sometimes there is like additional responsibilities put onto us, whether explicit or implicit, and how we navigate those and how it's important for Black parents to be aware. And then we also talked about just questioning the concept of like Black excellence, Black girl magic, Black boy joy, and how sometimes those terms, even though they're meant to have a positive impact, they also conceal power imbalances and systemic racism. And we concluded with a composite counter narrative that just unified our voices to kind of directly tell a message of what we want this paper to say.
In line with our messy conversations, we created reflection questions that we refer to as seeds. Seed number 1 was refraining your entry point. Seed number 2, supporting conversations between Black families. Seed number 3, supporting Black educators to support Black families. Seed number 4, Black representation in schools. Seed number 5, collecting, analyzing, and communicating. Seed number 6, building a power among Black families. And lastly, seed number 7, supporting a spectrum of homeschooling.
And what's so interesting as we think about this paper and reflect on it, the four of us get to hang out again after not being able to hang out for a while the paper was being published. But this paper was born out of relationship that the four of us had in different ways, in different capacities. It moved with relationship. And so, as Nana was sharing, there were many moments where the conversations were very healing and very therapeutic. And it led to a thoughtful unpacking of what relationship can look like when we allow for that messiness and we allow for that coming together. And I think part of what we wanted to do with this paper is to also push back against narratives in the academy that say that research needs to be in a nice, neat box, and to show the messiness in both our process and in our thinking. And in whatever way this paper can land for Black families and schools, educators, educational leaders, this is our offering to the school system to say more needs to be done. For a long time, debts have been owed. And it's time for us to roll up our sleeves, get into the messiness, and do the work that needs to be done to make sure that generations of Black children from now are experiencing very different outcomes and experiences in schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So these are the authors of the chapter Dear Black Parents, and they talk about counter narratives to the prevalent deficit discourses. So please, do read this chapter. And we are running a little bit over time. And now we have Rahat Zaidi and Patty Trussler talking about their chapter related to newcomer experiences.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Max, for this invitation. I'm so glad my co-author, Dr. Trussler, is here with us today to speak to the chapters. So we're going to just quickly, I'll try and give you a response to the questions provided. So in our case, we decided to feature one single family. This was Lula's family, and we are located in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And this particular chapter comes from a broader, larger study funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And there is a documentary that this chapter is based on. The documentary can be viewed and basically purchased from the following link that I'm providing in the chat box. So essentially, I am just give me a second here. I'll pull up my notes. I kind of lost them here. Okay, so the chapter highlights inequality in parent engagement by showing how newcomer parents' participation in schools is shaped by structural, linguistic, and cultural barriers rather than by a lack of care or interest. So we were a group of researchers who came together with this idea, and we were successfully funded by SSHRC to create a documentary. We worked in collaboration with an award-winning filmmaker, Nina Sudra, who's located in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and we embarked on this journey where we wanted to collect anecdotes and get to know practitioners, get to know families that were navigating unfamiliar school norms, language barriers, and experiences of misrecognition and deficit assumptions, which could lead to moments of marginalization. So as such, our particular case study highlights how Lula is publicly positioned as an inadequate parent during a classroom misunderstanding, for example, and goes beyond this particular moment to illustrate how school practices and dominant cultural expectations can reproduce unequal power relations between educators and newcomer parents, and how parents' knowledge and intentions are often misunderstood within institutional settings. So we set out to document broader systemic barriers that included things like racism, exclusion, limited institutional responsiveness to families' linguistic and cultural backgrounds, which further restrict equitable engagement and contribution, and do contribute definitely to anxiety, reduced feelings of belonging, and uneven access to support for newcomer families. So at the same time, I think we, in this particular chapter, we identified several possibilities for social justice through family-centric, equitable, and democratic approaches to parent engagement. So central to these possibilities is repositioning parents as knowledgeable partners and co-educators rather than passive recipients of school directives. So what was interesting about this particular family's case that's highlighted in this chapter is that through the process of engaging in dialogue, in spending time with this family, and in following them in their journey of settling into a city like Calgary, we basically focused on the relational spaces in which parents and educators can learn from one another and disrupt some of those deficit-based interpretations of newcomer families. So the chapter demonstrates that socially just engagement is grounded in empathy and strength-based practice. And we focused on small but meaningful actions, such as teachers taking time to understand family circumstances, recognizing students' cultural and religious identities, and building informal relationships beyond the classroom. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Trussler here to talk a little bit about how that relationship was built with Lula and what the implications were in terms of working with her and then taking it beyond from a practical perspective to teacher education programs and the impact of the documentary that was produced, which is called Bridging the Gap.
Well, thank you, Rahat. I guess I'll bring just a little bit of a personal perspective to this project as well as the documentary that was produced. So I came to this project primarily as a practitioner who had experienced a very successful model of instruction for newcomer youth from refugee backgrounds. And so when Rahat presented me with the possibility of participating in a research project focused on families with the goal of producing a documentary to share their stories, I was keen to get involved. And I knew that Lula's story would be the one to capture. A very close friend of mine had been the teacher of Lula's teenage daughter in the LEAD program here in Calgary. And this program is kind of described in our chapter as one that supports individuals who have come from backgrounds with interrupted education, most often the time refugee backgrounds. And this friend of mine had continued to stay connected with Lula's family over the past 10 years. The program, as Rahat outlined, included taking time to understand the family's circumstances and their religious and cultural identities. And this relationship then was something that could extend beyond the classroom. So our chapter shares 4 anecdotes of how Lula's family navigated both the challenges, but as well as the opportunities of a single mother of 4 young children arriving in Canada after spending over 10 years in a refugee camp in Africa. Her family was eager to participate in the study as they wanted a chance to share their fond feelings as a result of the long-standing relationship they'd had with the school and mostly the teacher, my friend, that I mentioned earlier. So fundamentally, this initial relationship was a springboard for Lula and for the children to feel welcomed, empowered, and respected, which in turn helped Lula to be the positive matriarch of both her family, but as we discovered, the Ethiopian community here in Calgary. And the documentary project indeed did come to fruition, just interruptions of COVID and so on. In my present role as a pre-service instructor in a local university's education program, we're using the documentary as a prompt to discuss the importance of understanding stories of all families, especially those who come from less privileged backgrounds. It is with great pride when I hear young teachers refer to Lula as someone who has taught them how to listen, how to be curious, and from whom they can learn. I'll turn it back to Rahat if you want any final words.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So essentially, we're, as Patty said, we're basically using, we hope to further disseminate the impact of arts-based methodologies, which in this case provided the backdrop for this work that we did with several families, and highlighted in particular Lula's family within Bridging the Gap. And we are hoping that through a focus on things like empathy, characteristics like resilience, focusing on calling in rather than calling out, creating space for dialogue and drawing on families' funds of knowledge, we will be able to further impact teacher practice within our local context, but on a national and a global level as well. So thank you for this opportunity for sharing some thoughts. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Rahat and Patty. Yeah, so I think it's arts-based is a powerful way of sending the message and get into the hearts and minds of people. And obviously, immigration is like immigrant parents. Like everybody has their race, class, and gender, right? But then, of course, if you're an immigrant parent, then that's an extra layer of sometimes burden, sometimes maybe possibility, but it's often like extra hard work because it's a different education system and you have to learn about it and navigate, so it's never easy. Thank you so much. So now we have Dr. Debbie Pusher, who kindly agreed to come up with her remarks about our book. And then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. We're kind of running a little bit over time, but hopefully people can stay and we can chat a bit. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Max. It's just been really a pleasure to journey with you with your new edited book. I'd like to congratulate all the authors for the rich chapters and the kinds of contributions you're making to the field of parent and family engagement. I think there will be new conversations as a result of your work, richer, deeper conversations in some areas. And so that is really just so important. And I've enjoyed your book so much. I want to begin just by acknowledging that I live and work on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. I would like to pay my respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationships with one another. So one of the things I loved about the book is the breadth of it. So many countries represented, so many distinct and unique contexts represented, and so many conceptualizations that you've worked with in your chapters and that you've played with, you've deepened, you've developed. So there is a lot for everyone in reading your book. One of the things that I particularly valued was all of those stories of experience that you shared as authors, getting to know parents, getting to know teachers, reading the excerpts from transcripts, the stories, the conversation threads, seeing the examples really brings this work to life. It moves it from being sort of generic and global in that sense to particular and specific. And I think so often what we learn comes from the details of people's lives, those stories they carry, often invisible to us if we don't have the opportunity to truly hear them and listen to them. So one of the parts of the book that was really powerful for me. So as I read, I know section 1 was to show inequity, section 2 to show us possible ways to move away from that. But what struck me as I read the various chapters was how much the school-centric structures and processes that are historic in our schools persist. We've had 50, 60 years of work in this field now. We've moved from talking about parent involvement to parent engagement to talking about co-construction to talking about family-centric approaches rather than school-centric. And yet, in some ways, in some places, that progress is still slow. What the heck? Why is that? What is happening that we're not moving harder, faster than we are after all the work that we've done? Some of the things that stuck out for me is that there is still a lot of fear. Fear for teachers, fear for parents and families, fear for kids, right? We are continuing to be afraid of one another, right? As a teacher, I'm worried as a parent that you're going to criticize my teaching or find fault with me, that I'm going to be too vulnerable if I open my classroom to you as parents. Parents feel vulnerable. The teacher has expertise. I don't know if I should say anything because I don't have that kind of professional knowledge, or even, if I say something, will my child pay a price because of my engagement? Just so many things happening with that fear piece. So as we move forward, how do we, we've talked a lot about things that are invisible, right? How do we make those things visible? How do we emotionally share what we're feeling about this work and talk to each other about that? I think that piece is really important. Another thing that struck me is, as educators, we still don't really know our families, right? They come to meet the teacher night, they show up for parent-teacher conferences, they come to the school council meetings, but we don't really know them. And so that's a piece that I see in so many of the chapters becoming a really important piece. What do we do to dwell with families, to dwell in community, to get to know our families by listening to them, by hearing their stories, by asking for their perspectives, by going to their places of worship, the grocery stores, their communities, their homes. There are so many ways we can know our families if we put time into knowing them. It came forward for me that there's a burden carried by some people more than others. So we heard about the burden of mothers, the burden when you have, say, a Muslim identity, the burden of Black and Indigenous, both educators and parents. So how do we work as a field to ensure that everybody sees parent and family engagement as their work? Not just because I'm a Black mother, not just because I'm an Indigenous advocate for children and so on. How do we say this belongs to everybody? And so that's a piece of work I think we have yet to do. Lots of writing in the chapters about challenging beliefs and assumptions, right? And it's that notion that when we know better, we'll do better. Maya Angelou's, words to us. And so we really have to spend time making beliefs and assumptions visible, unpacking them, challenging them, rethinking them. That's critical work. And then I think there's still a lack of understanding of what meaningful and authentic parent engagement is. Not just doing homework with my child, right? The way that we're often asked to do, but what's meaningful and authentic, both to the educators, but especially to the families and the children. And so those are things that really popped out to me as I read between and across chapters. So the big question, I think what Max is asking all of you as authors is, what are we going to do about it? How do we change this? And one of the things that I started to think hard about as I read your book was we're really trying to make a foray into teacher education, to have teachers learn about families very early on in their professional programs in order to be ready to work in equitable and socially just ways with them when they become teachers. And so that's critical, right? But what really I began to think about as I read your work is, you know what? We need teacher education, but there's 3 legs to our stool, right? We also need parent education, and we also need students' education about parent and family engagement. We hear in some of the stories parents deferring to teachers. Oh, they know best. I'll step back. How do we show parents through parent education that you hold so much knowledge? How do we begin to foreground their parent knowledge? How do we begin to build their efficacy? When parents say, the teacher isn't letting me in, I don't know what else to do, how do we ensure that parents have learned strategies and ways of saying, well, I didn't get an invitation, but maybe I'll make an invitation. Maybe I'll invite that teacher to my home for a home visit or a family visit. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do there. And then students too, right? We have these myths that have been perpetuated. Kids don't want their parents engaged. This is a time for independence. And so we need to push the parents away so the kids can stand on their own 2 feet. And yet look at us here all gathered together. We aren't independent, we're interdependent. This book is a result of many people's efforts, and our progress in the field is a result of many people's efforts. So there's myths out there that I think we have to deconstruct in order to move forward. So some of the things I heard you saying this morning is we need to enhance our relationships. I think good programming, good education is one way to do that. It's a way to make visible that emotional labor that's happening, the invisible labor that's happening. I think it's a way to create a more common understanding of meaningful and authentic parent engagement, what it is, why it's important, how to do it. And I think, right now we often do the work with the teachers, but then when we want parents to engage and be co-constructors and co-decision makers. But if they don't get the kind of opportunity for learning, discussion, thinking through challenging beliefs and assumptions, how do they ever come to the table equitably? So when we think about education, I think we have to think about that education for students and parents as well as for teachers. The Honorable Murray Sinclair led our Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and he's just passed recently, which is a real loss for the world. But Murray Sinclair used to say, education got us into this mess, because he was talking about residential schooling and that whole awful history. He said, education got us into this mess, and it's education that's going to get us out of it. And so that's why I think when we think about education in and around parent and family engagement, it has to be education for all partners, not just teachers. So if we're going to have these kinds of opportunities, then it means that in our school divisions, in our not-for-profit organizations, in our governments, in our policy documents, parent engagement has to be foregrounded as a priority, right? It is sometimes, it isn't often. And so how do we ensure it's a priority? How do we work towards that? And how do we ensure it's resourced, right? Teachers get time and money for math PD, math resources, math in-servicing. How much money, time, resourcing do they get for their work with parents and families? So again, that resourcing piece becomes important. But I do think that when we move this into the foreground in a maybe more comprehensive way, all partners, then we can begin to move from that individualistic kind of look. It's that teacher, it's that parent, it's that child, into that systemic or systematic approach that we're working toward. So I know for me in reading your book, I found it evocative, I found it provocative, I was challenged to think in new ways with new concepts. I was challenged to understand context I'd never thought about or didn't know. And I, scribbled notes madly about, oh, here's something to think about. Here's something that needs to be done. So I sort of have an agenda moving forward as a result of reading the book. And I'm sure that other readers are going to have that same kind of feeling. So thanks for the privilege of this journey with you. And thanks for the great work you've put out into the world, work that we really need. So good stuff. Thank you.